Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, years ago, you as students would have actually been staying on the third floor. That very different era for fee, but that was a procedure once. Indeed, I stayed up there on my first conference when I attended here. But, welcome back. I hope you all had a good lunch and another good lecture by Yvonne. I want to talk about environmental issues, kind of switching gears a bit from my talk earlier on. The environment is one of those political issues that is quite important in Washington. That it's certainly a dominant issue today. It's one of the major priorities of this administration, the whole question about climate change, energy transformation. It ties into the question of what to do about the automobile companies. It has enormous implications for taxes and spending in the economy. But it's been a political issue for a number of years, and it's one which politicians of all stripes like to try to get their hands on. In 1988, when Vice President Bush was running for the presidency, he said he wanted to be the environmental president. He and Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts argued with one another, whose city was in worse environmental shape. Was it Boston or was it Dallas or whatever? Kind of exchanging accusations, who was to blame for the supposed low environmental quality of their respective cities. And there's a reason why politicians appeal on these issues. If you poll Americans, 8 out of 10 Americans say they're environmentalists, whatever that means. Half of them say they're strong environmentalists. If you ask people, kind of a set of specific questions, majorities give the politically correct answer. They, of course, want automobiles that pollute less and use less gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, in their own actions, they go out and buy SUVs. But at least there's a perception in terms of what the correct answer is on these things. I mean, certainly a sense in terms of what one's goal should be in terms of the environment. Businesses responded to this. There are a lot of different products and catalogs, and that businesses kind of sell as being environmentally friendly. They're biodegradable, they're CFC free, rechargeable batteries, recycled paper. Groups out there that sell their paper bags by saying it's all made out of recycled paper. These sorts of things. There's clearly a perception that there's an appeal here to be made. There's enormous social pressure that at times comes to bear on these issues. Part of it comes out of the educational process. Actually, Sheldon Richman tells a story. I don't know if he's told it so far. You might hear it later on. But when he pulled, I think it was his daughter, out of elementary school and decided to homeschool, he said because he was tired of having religion taught in the classes, the religion of environmentalism, that there certainly is an ideological push there. The New York Times did a story a number of years ago about parents who, changed their behavior when their kids went off to camp or were out of the house. They had a Traverse City, Michigan woman who said, for the 2 weeks that her son went off to camp, she could go back and use styrofoam cups again. Now, when he showed up, he'd hector her to death, or she had to get paper and what have you. They didn't work as well. She was really tired of it. But it's very interesting to see how, there's a certain pressure that gets permeated throughout society. The law also plays a role. We see, more intrusive regulations, more intrusive controls. The city of Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is basically a suburb of Washington, D.C., is noted for its progressiveness. It sends out recycling coordinators, as they are called, to comb through people's trash. And if you have the wrong good in the wrong bag, you can get a fine of up to $500. So it's not only kind of social pressure, but obviously the law is brought in then as well as a backup. You find that in Washington, D.C., and a number of other places. In my Fairfax County, where I live, it is mandatory that recycling be offered. So there's a separate truck that goes by and separate bins and whatever. But nobody cares. There's no enforcement, what have you. But some places take it clearly much, much more seriously. And I think in a broad sense, kind of interest in the environment, concern about environmental amenities is very important. It's an area where I think at times people on the free market side have not made their case very well. The issue is not that environmental amenities are somehow antagonistic to economic development, antagonistic to economic success. To the contrary, most people recognize environmental amenities are very important. Most of us want clean air. We want clean water. There's a certain beauty to a place like Yosemite or Yellowstone. Most people don't think of, wouldn't the best thing you could do is put a Walmart on top of, say, Old Faithful or whatnot. Most of us, I think, appreciate environmental amenities. So it should not be viewed that the environment is somehow contrary to economic development, contrary to freedom values. And, to the contrary, the environment is something I think people of all, persuasions can appreciate and have an interest in trying to preserve. The problem, I would argue, and kind of the focus of my discussion here, is that there's a real problem in the way the environmental issue plays out in politics today. What we do is we have a very powerful politicization of the environmental issue. That what we get is not actually good environmental protection. What we do is we find the environment becomes a hostage of politics. Indeed, the political process is used in a way that very often gives us worse environmental protection at higher cost. That we end up doing dumb things and spending more money that's necessary to try to protect environmental values that we would like to see preserved. I think it's important to realize if you look at Washington, D.C., the divide is really not between, kind of conservative and liberal or Republican and Democrat. The divide is much more between political process and market process, between people who want to use state power, want to use command and control, want to direct, and people who'd much prefer to leave those powers, those activities well beyond the political process. What you will find is most Republican politicians, unfortunately, are not much different than Democrats in wanting to use government for their own ends. Now, they may have a slightly different end, but you don't find, in practice, in terms of how people vote, a lot of people out there who really want the market. Rather, they want the politics, but they just want it for a somewhat different purpose. A number of years ago, I had an article that was critical of Western water subsidies, other interferences into the marketplace, by government subsidies of interests, and I received a letter from the head of the Mountain States Legal Foundation. Now, Mountain States Legal Foundation presents itself as a free market institution, done some very good litigation on behalf of property rights. However, the head of it complained that, well, we need these subsidies. We need these water projects. We need these timbering subsidies. We want ours. That, they weren't asking for get government out. They were saying, have government help us. And that, I think, is much of the problem that we see in terms of the debate in Washington. That what we need to do is you'll recognize that it doesn't particularly matter which side you're supporting. The question is, should government be doing that kind of thing at all? And I would argue that's a real problem that we have, that we've politicized much of that policy. Now, in looking at environmental issues and trying to decide what to do on the environment, it's very important to at least kind of step back and try to figure out what's the status of the environment. What are the problems out there? I think it's very important to recognize that you can't just talk about the environment. The environment is extraordinarily complex. There are enormous amounts of aspects of the environment. Different issues, different problems, different regions. So one has to start kind of picking apart and say, what do you mean by an environmental problem? Everything, local, whatnot. Lester Brown of World Watch a few years ago wrote that we're in a battle to save the Earth's environmental support systems. He wrote about global warming, growing population, disappearing species, expanding deserts, depleting topsoil, kind of went on and on. The sort of thing you don't even want to get up in the morning, right? You just kind of pull your covers over your head and forget it. If all this stuff's going on, it sounds like the world's about to end. But it turns out, if you start looking at particular issues, peeling it away, you find that on many issues, the environment's doing much better. If you look, for example, in terms of the United States air and water quality, extraordinary improvements over the last 30 or 40 years. You look at emissions, carbon monoxide, ozone, soot, sulfides, a number of things. Down dramatically, many of these down between a third, two-thirds. Lead, down by 97%. Waterways, much cleaner. Lots of good news out there. You look at auto emissions. Total auto emissions are down by a third, even though there are more cars on the road, more miles driven. Emissions have come down. Now, what this reflects, of course, is many things. People point out, look, the law has been changed. There's an EPA, and that's true. But much of the improvements started before we set up an Environmental Protection Agency. One of the important aspects of economic growth is that people tend to focus first on becoming relatively prosperous. And then once they're relatively prosperous, they start worrying about a lot of other things. They become much more capable of taking care of other things. We see that not only in the United States, but we see that in poor countries. A country like Taiwan, a country like South Korea, indeed, to some degree, China. It's very interesting. In China today, we see much more of an environmental movement. Opposition to the Three Gorges Dam project. It lost. This is a huge priority for the Communist Party. But there was actually an environmental movement that was active trying to oppose that. The point is, as suddenly your family is no longer starving, you can start thinking about the quality of your air. You can start thinking about other things. So in the United States, we've had dramatic improvement, even starting even before the laws were changed. And the transformation of technology, the ability to deal with these things, yeah, there's still issues out there. But the world looks a lot more positive today in America on air and water quality, for example, than it did 30 or 40 years ago. Hazardous waste sites like Love Canal and Times Beach, the view is they're not as dangerous as we once thought they were. Packaging is getting lighter. Indeed, it prolongs food life. A lot of good news there. You look at petroleum resources. I mean, this whole issue about should we use hydrocarbons, the question of global warming. But what's interesting is if you look at over the last, say, 30, 40 years, even as we are using oil, there's an increase in total proven oil reserves. Now, that doesn't mean there's more dinosaurs dying, right? Kind of done with that. But it does mean that because of differences in technology and economics, we can now reach, drill, and recover oil that we could not 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. You can drill deeper, you can slant drill, you can do a whole bunch of things. So what you find is some of these resources, indeed, to some, I mean, in some ultimate sense, they are exhaustible. But economically, given changes in a marketplace and technology, in the short term, they have yet to be exhausted. So there's a lot of good news out there. It doesn't mean there's no bad news, but it means you have to be very careful in kind of recognizing what are the challenges out there, and not to assume that everything's becoming a disaster. Now, I would argue there are two different ways in which politics has really intruded within the environmental policy. The first is where government itself has tried to be the environmental steward and has done a really bad job. It should not surprise us that you put something in Washington's hands, that the folks in Capitol Hill have a very wide agenda and environmental protection is not terribly high on it. The federal government owns about 200 million acres of forest land, for example. Now, federal forest land tends to be interspersed with private forest land. A lot of these areas are very distant, they're wild, they're wilderness, it's quite expensive. You want to build a road into virgin territory, you're going to spend a huge amount of money. You want to open areas up to logging, it's going to cost you a lot of bucks. Well, the nice thing about the federal government, of course, is it has an inexhaustible, at least almost inexhaustible budget. Spend as much as it wants. So the Forest Service, which in Washington happens to be lodged with the Agriculture Department for reasons that are hard to understand, but that's Washington. The Forest Department spends money for the purpose of opening up areas for logging. It loses money. I mean, there are years, the Songus rainforest up in Alaska, the government would spend $1 and get 1 penny back in revenue. But former Ted Stevens, senator, no longer in the Senate, congressmen and others up there, say, we need this. Logging jobs, right? 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 loggers, they'll vote for us. Who cares about the cost? So the federal government has spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to open up logging areas and wasted the money. These are areas that would not be logged otherwise. And indeed, the federal government development here not only opens up federal land, it opens up private land. Because there are a lot of areas of private land that's interspersed, but the private folks could never afford to go in and build a road. But if the feds are kind enough to build the road, you can open up a whole area. So here's an area then where taxpayer resources are wasted, and you're opening up development in an area where you otherwise wouldn't have development. That it's basically an assault both on environmental amenities and on the taxpayers. This is very much how Washington policy tends to work. I find the same thing with water. Now, federal government, supposedly is worried about wetlands, no net loss of wetlands. There's a whole question about wetland production where it kind of navigable rivers is now considered to be even dry land as long as it has some vague connection somewhere to something that might be navigable somewhere else. So people go to prison because they put, clean, filled dirt on top of dry land in the names of, protecting wetlands. But the federal government a number of years ago, the Garrison Diversion Project up in North Dakota spent about $1.2 billion, and that's when dollars really meant something, building this huge water diversion project for farmers, and it destroyed about 70,000 acres of wetlands. Now, the environment didn't matter so long as North Dakota had a very important legislator who wanted to get this passed to help him get reelected. The federal government has been utterly destructive in terms of wetlands. If you look at water projects, one of the great places to look at water projects is California. San Joaquin Valley is semi-arid territory. Now, if you live in California and you live in Los Angeles, you have periodic water shortages. The drought, my dad lives in San Diego, everybody gets upset, it's not raining, stop serving water in restaurants, this is terrible, we don't have enough water, this is awful. Of course, all the water is going up to San Joaquin Valley. So the feds spend about 10 times as much to do the water, get the water, as they charge the farmers for it, while consumers are desperate down in Southern California for water. Now, this is an absolutely nutty system. And it's compounded by price supports. That is, we pay farmers to grow and not grow things. It all depends. We pay them to be dairy farmers, and after a number of years, there's this huge glut. This happened in the Reagan administration. Huge glut, dairy products. So, Washington can do one of two things. It could stop paying them to do this, or it could pay them to stop having farms. And that's, of course, what it did. So after spending, decades paying, dairy farmers to have lots of cows, they then paid them to kill the cows. One farmer at the time said, I feel I've hit the lottery. Got like $8 million check. My reaction is, that's very nice, but it's not like you paid, right? We paid, yeah, you got the lottery. Well, there are also subsidies for all sorts of crops, including rice. Now, if you were looking around the country and said, where should I grow rice? Right? Now, would semi-arid terrain in California be your first choice? Probably not. But if the feds are willing to subsidize your water, and they're willing to pay you for the rice, why not grow rice in the San Joaquin Valley? Sounds good to me. This is a policy that is financially stupid and environmentally destructive. You put it together. Indeed, so desperate at one point a few years ago was California for more water, they created what they called the toilet to tap program. That sounds really appetizing, doesn't it? It was going to take toilet water and recycle it and make it safe so everybody could drink it. Now, I have no doubt that they made it very safe and everybody could drink it. Nevertheless, it does just have kind of a ring about it that you'd think it might make more sense not to take it and waste it all in the first place, as opposed to have to spend tens of millions of dollars to go through this process. But this is typical of the way the government operates. It creates a problem, announces a crisis, and comes up with yet even more expensive mechanisms to deal with the problem, which of course still doesn't solve it. And we go on and on. See, much of the same issue in terms of grazing land. Federal grazing land is in poor condition. It's rent out to private ranchers at lower than market rates. For a number of years, federal government engaged in a process that was called chaining. It would book up huge chains between tractors and pull out pinyon pines and underbrush to create more grazing land. It's quite expensive. Of course, they would never get the money back. No private owner of land could afford to do that, because you would be dumping money basically into a hole, never recovering it. Since it was the federal government, this was not a problem. The role of the Bureau of Land Reclamation was to have more. We have to have more land, says the BLM. More land to rent out. Again, expensive, waste of money, environmentally destructive. And there are a number of the issues, big issues that come along where it's, there's a tendency, you should always kind of look for what the government has done in this. It isn't responsible for everything, but there are a lot of issues where you look hard enough and you'll find some really dumb government policy. For example, the whole question about toxic waste. This is one of those esoteric policy nerd issues. What do you do about toxic wastes? But it's become a very important political issue. And there was a time, Times Beach, Missouri became one, Love Canal, New York, big issue. Hooker Chemical, evil Hooker, chemical company, terrible, big plot of land, chemicals, leach out. Federal government ran in, bought all these homes, all sorts of stuff. Well, Reason magazine, a number of years ago, did an expose on this, like a 20-page article, very well detailed, went back to the original documents. And what they found was, Hooker Chemical shows up. Hooker Chemical does what chemical companies do, which is if you make chemicals, there are byproducts. It's inevitable. So they bought this big piece of land, used state-of-the-art containment at the time. You dig a big hole, you put in clay to seal it, you dump junk in it, fill it up, cover it up with more clay, then plant grass on top and have a field. The local school board showed up. The local school board said, that's a nice piece of land. We'd kind of like to have that. This is all documented in school board records. Reason went through all this stuff. And Hooker Chemical said, that's really not a good idea, And what the school board says is, well, if you don't sell it to us, we will use eminent domain. Remember kilo. We will use eminent domain and take it. Okay? So Hooker said, okay, here it is. Here's your deed. They call it quick claim deed. We tell you there's bad stuff there. At a couple of school board meetings, Hooker even sent its lawyers in to say, no, we want to remind you, what's underneath this. Didn't care. School board divided the land and sold off part of it to developers. Now, what do developers do to land? They dig. They dig. So what do you do when you dig in a toxic waste site? Well, bad things happen, like chemicals get all over. So this set in train this whole crisis, because of course it leached out into the community, neighboring homes were affected, homes built on top of this, disaster. Now there are, I think it's very important to recognize, there are corrupt and evil corporations. Human beings are evil. Private sector is not perfect. There are companies that engage in what we call midnight dumping. You should look around, nobody's around, dump the stuff on somebody's property, right? Companies go bankrupt, have an environmental problem. So, there are issues out there. But here's a clear case where it was government officials, because at the end of the day, the school board couldn't care less. Hooker Chemical knew if they sold this kind of land off to somebody, they would be held legally liable. School board members were long gone by the time this all becomes a problem. Who of them was held accountable? No one. No one. Fairly typical. They're concerned about the rainforest in Brazil. Well, one of the greatest destroyers of the rainforest has been World Bank subsidies. Very generous of the World Bank, paid for by you all, of course. America is the largest contributor to the World Bank and the IMF and everybody else. Lots of development subsidies around the world. Massive environmental, big water projects, dams in India. Peasants kicked off their land. Deforestation projects in Indonesia. This stuff all subsidized by the West. It is not to say that local governments might not do dumb things in some of these areas otherwise, but if you provide them with cheap loans, no surprise you're going to get worse results. That one cannot act surprised then when this sort of destruction happens. When energy price control was a big issue before Reagan took office. If you want to have sensible energy policy, what you want to do is have market prices for energy. Instead, we had price controls here. Now, the signal that sends out, of course, is to tell everybody, use lots of it, don't look for alternatives, don't use it more efficiently. But this is U.S. policy for decades, price controls. Indeed, at one point, they had price controls on natural gas, so naturally everybody wanted to use natural gas. So the federal government, again, you don't get rid of the price controls. They passed a new piece of legislation called the Fuel Use Act, which told who could use natural gas. Literally, this factory could, those people couldn't, It had allocated. Government steps further and further and further in. When I was in law school, we had gas lines out in Stanford because the government decided who got how much gasoline. So the richest country on earth, and we're sitting here in a stupid gas line. It's monstrous because it's all allocated out of Washington. So what you find is here's a policy which is incredibly stupid and also anti-environmental, because you want gasoline prices to go up to get people to use less of them. You don't want to hold prices low because it encourages people to use it more. Very anti-environmental policy. You look at Katrina, you look at the Barrier Islands, you look at a number of kind of coastal issues, government flood insurance. There are a lot of places where it's beautiful to build. The only problem is we know with great regularity hurricanes will show up. So who should pay the cost if the hurricane wipes out your house? Well, it turns out you do. You're very generous of you. You subsidize an insurance program, flood insurance program, so that people can build in environmentally sensitive, flood-prone areas. Because it would be terrible if they couldn't build where they wanted to, apparently. This is ridiculous. Part of the problem on Katrina was badly built levees that were all politicized in terms of the local politicians deciding where the money went and for what. And they preferred not to put it into the kind of a legitimate activity of good levees. Instead, they put it off into all sorts of other pork barrel activities. We see this again and again, where the government gets engaged in really bad, really stupid things. So one should not assume the government's going to be an environmental steward. There are going to be a number of these areas where government and the way the political system operates are likely to get bad results as opposed to good results. So that's one set then of kind of political issues. Another set of political issues, I would argue, are legitimate issues, legitimate environmental concerns that tend to be turned into artificial crises. Where what you do is you don't get a particularly good debate over the facts and the science, and instead what you do is you get a scare campaign. Scare campaigns that tend to be pretty much divorced from the reality. One was ALAR. Now this is a pesticide used on apples. About 20 years ago, became a big issue. Natural Resources Defense Council decided to mount a campaign against ALAR. And they had one study that had been done about 20 years before that. And this gets very complex, the issue of rats. If you kind of stuff enough ALAR into rats, and if they develop cancer, what's the impact? How do you decide that impact on human beings? So they wanted to get rid of ALAR because of this one study. Had enormous impact, created furor. Apple growers went out of business. People stopped eating apples. It became quite a scandal in the United States. Yet the study, which had been the question of ALAR on rats, Britain's Advisory Committee on Pesticides, as well as the California Department of Agriculture, had both looked at it and said, we don't see any risk here for human beings, given the amount that human beings consume. There's a complicated relationship trying to move from kind of rats to humans anyway, and the question of concentration, a very complex scientific area. Their conclusion was this is not a threat, in terms of human safety. United Nations panel from the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization didn't even believe that the ALAR caused cancer in rats. Dr. Joseph Rosen of Rutgers said there never was any legitimate scientific study to justify the scare here. But what happened was, rather than having kind of a serious debate, and there are serious issues here. I mean, some pesticides can be bad. Chemicals can have negative side effects. This is not to suggest there is no technology that has no negative impact, whether it be on human beings or the environment. But what you had here is the NRDC hired a political communications firm called Fenton Communications, which organized a PR campaign. They got the noted scientist Meryl Streep to help them out. And what they did is they launched this campaign, got her on the cover of Time magazine, got 60 Minutes, and they put out a memo actually to groups they worked with after that saying, here's how you do it. Here's how you get lots of PR. Here's how you make it happen. So what you had is, what could have been a serious discussion about an issue that suddenly becomes purely politics. I mean, it's all focused on PR. And the issue of pesticides is one of those where it's easy to scare people. I mean, there are a number of ways in which the environmental issue, the whole question about relative risk assessment. Human beings react in very strange ways in terms of what they're afraid of and what they aren't afraid of. I mean, the standing joke, is that somebody will drive to a hearing on, do cell phones cause cancer in your brain? They'll drive to a hearing not wearing a seatbelt and smoking. Well, of those three activities, the most dangerous are the ones they're engaged in, and the one they're worried about is the one that's least dangerous. Well, the same thing in terms of pesticides. Natural pesticides are quite common. The way nature protects plants from bugs is pesticides in nature. In at least 57 food groups, natural pesticides occur in higher concentrations than artificial pesticides. But virtually nobody worries about artificial pesticides. One of the great numbers, in my view, is that the risk of getting cancer from the residue of pesticides in all the food you will eat today is about 1/20th the risk of cancer from the natural carcinogens in 1 cup of coffee. Now, you are not likely to get cancer from that cup of coffee, but it gives you a sense of the relative risk. People tend to be more concerned about that 1/20th of the risk than the risk from the coffee. So this is one of those areas where it's easy to, I think, find what kind of fear is fanned, whether or not, irrespective of the science. It's also a question of acid rain. Now, acid rain became an issue in the early 1980s. SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide. The question is, were sulfur dioxide emissions killing forests? So you had a number of forests that were being killed. You had lakes that were becoming acidic, and the argument was that SO2 emissions were doing this. There was an EPA study that was conducted in 1987. It concluded that this was not the likely cause, created a firestorm, political firestorm, people got fired. Congress decided to spend $500 million on the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Project, which went out there and did a serious survey of the issue of SO2 emissions. Now, what they concluded was that only about 3.5% of Northeast lakes were critically acidic. Most had very little recreation value. It found that lakes on average, were no more acidic today than before the onset of the Industrial Revolution, which suggests a problem with the theory. If you say that pollution is making lakes more acidic, they should be a lot more acidic today than before the pollution was emitted. It found that lakes in Florida were more acidic, even though the rain was only about 1/3 as acidic as up north. I mean, it suggested there was something wrong with the theory. But it basically had no impact on policy. Congress went ahead, added something, kind of an SO2 permits trading program to the Clean Air Act, and off we went. They spent $500 million on a scientific survey, didn't particularly care what the scientific survey said. Now, the current and very complex issue kind of dominates discussion. It's one in which even noted scientists have trouble dealing with, and I will confess I'm not, obviously, a scientific PhD, is the climate. Now, climate is kind of a long, fear of apocalyptics. Back in the 1890s and the 1950s, people were afraid of global warming. It's not the first time people have been afraid of a warmer climate. What's interesting is if you look at the 1960s and the 1970s, there's a very different fear. The danger, I think, one has to keep in mind of short-term predictions and recognize how this changes over time. I like to go to used bookstores and pick up old books and magazines. There's a National Geographic from 1976, which quotes Dr. Murray Mitchell of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He says, since about 1940, there's been a distinct drop in average global temperature. It's fallen about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit. And the article goes on and talks about expanding glaciers, lower temperatures, and fear of a new ice age. This is fairly common at the time. And this is not particularly peer-reviewed literature. This is much more kind of common stuff, but it's interesting how common it was at the time, the discussion, because temperatures were clearly falling. There is a Time magazine, for example, declared in 1974, the atmosphere has been growing gradually cooler for the past 3 decades. The trend shows no indication of reversing. In 1981, scientist named Fred Hoyle published a book, I love the title, Ice, the Ultimate Human Catastrophe. Now what he wrote was, it is 12,500 years since the last ice age ended, which means the next one is long overdue. When the ice comes, most of modern America, Britain, and Northern Europe will disappear under the glaciers. The right conditions can occur within a single decade. Now what he wanted, his solution, was to engage in a crash program of warming the oceans. So now I just imagine if in 1981 we had engaged in a crash program of warming the oceans. And a few years later, people would have come on and say, oh my God, look, what are you doing? Right? But this was fairly common at the time. It was widespread. I mean, these sentiments, Rolling Stone magazine, noted scientific publication, had an article that said, according to one theory, all it would take is a simple cold summer to plunge the Earth into a sudden apocalyptic ice age. Pretty wild stuff. Now, Coulger was writing in National Wildlife Federation's publication, International Wildlife. He said, the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and human misery. Now, this is an active environmentalist in an environmentalist publication. And there's this